before I spoke. So I would say, I'm not really an expert, but I think. And he would say to me, well, if you're not an expert, then why should anybody listen to you? So I kind of learned how to present myself in a masculine way, with a loud voice, with a kind of body language that says, I'm here. And that, I think that's been helpful, but I also think women are still navigating how to wield the same authority as men without being judged too tough, or again, the B word, really. And you saw that, of course, even in the women running for president on the Democratic ticket this time, and during the primaries, lots of double standards. So I think it has gotten vastly better. I still think it is maybe easier to get your foot in the door, although you look at the Senate, you look at the Fortune 500, it's woefully short of women. But you're judged quite harshly, I think, once you are a leader.
Well, I think that's a really interesting question, and I want to follow up on that. What you're saying about progress across different fields really resonates with what I've heard from my own parents who were both in the medical profession. And my mother went to medical school in 1976, and I think was asked in the interview process whether she was being considered as an affirmative action case. The interviews used to be fairly tough and sometimes quite abrasive. And now, of course, medical, and my dad was very supportive of that, and one of the first residents at the University of Washington to take paternity leave when it was offered, which he did when I was born.
So he's a pioneer.
So I've always grown up with those examples and those stories. And now, today medical classes are usually over 50% women.
Yeah.
Right. And so that progress is something I think we should really definitely look back on and celebrate just how different it is from even a generation or a half a generation to another. But I wanted to ask you because I can't pass up on this opportunity. President Johnson argued pretty strongly during his lifetime for, more women taking on policy leadership positions. And once famously argued that at one point we would in fact have a woman in the White House. And so we now have a Vice President-elect Harris. And so I wanted to, follow up on this your comments about what the women who were involved in the Democratic primary and in running for office this cycle faced, and also note that this is a barrier, another barrier that is falling, and to ask you, you pointed out that sometimes the work isn't done when you get the position, when you get into a job. Maybe especially if you're there for the first time, right? That you can face continued challenges or questions as you try to actually do and carry out that role. And so I wanted to ask you, about what you anticipate might be some of the significant challenges that would face the first woman to hold the vice presidency. What do you think those will be?
Wow. So those challenges are definitely still there. And again, in some ways, it's easier to get in because that's explicit bias, right? People now know that you want women to be the first so that other women can follow them. And so it's much easier to say, yes, I'm going to vote for a woman. The way you evaluate her is much more likely to be implicit bias. So just the one example many of us have probably experienced: if I talk exactly the same amount as the guy next to me in a meeting, I will be judged as having talked too much, because people are not used to hearing women. They have an implicit bias that you expect men to dominate the meeting. And so if you get equal time, you will be judged if you ask the men later, oh, she talked a lot. Or, of course, they are less inclined to hear the ideas that she put forward. We've all been through that, where you say something and a man says the same thing and he gets the credit. And there are many, many examples of that kind of implicit bias, where the man is perfectly well-intentioned. He's just acting on a deeply embedded set of social stereotypes. And if you're a woman of color, So back to Kamala Harris, you've got that in multiples, right? So for instance, if you're an African-American woman, or probably any woman of color, but particularly African-American, and you say anything that might sound remotely angry, you're marching right into a stereotype. People will pick up on that. They will hear it again. I mean, it was extraordinary to watch Kamala Harris with Pence, because she had that smile on her face the whole time, because she knew that if she betrayed any anger, and you saw Biden get angry, Trump certainly got angry, she couldn't, right? She couldn't, because then she would have immediately been that angry woman of color. Then there's that stereotype then means she's just judged much more harshly. So there's a kind of minefield there where on the one hand, you are breaking the barrier, and it's increasingly important not just to break the barrier, but to actually be who you are, right? So for a long time in national security, I would be the only woman or one of two at the table, but I would not say what I actually thought a lot of the time. I mean, for instance, I would never have said, well, I actually think we should spend as much on early education as we do on national defense. I'd have been laughed out of the room. So I was still modeling myself on the men around me. But when you're the first, you've got to be super careful, right? To do that good job, to not confirm any stereotypes. Another example, when I was at the State Department, I did write that article, but I stayed for 2 full years before I left, because that's the minimum time that an academic who is in government stays, right? And I did a job knowing that others were going to follow me. So it's still, I think Kamala Harris will find that she has to carve a path that is strong and decisive and still feminine, and kind of reassuring, to kind of counter all these stereotypes.
I think that's a really important point. And there's also the balance between, as you said, speaking your mind, being yourself, and figuring out what will effectively advance a policy agenda.
Yeah.
I remember in 2017, when I moved to Jefferson City, Missouri, the governor's mansion, as far as I was able to find, had never had a working spouse. And so that was a really interesting role for me to take on. And I actually didn't realize I was doing it until an article appeared in the paper, and the campaign advisor happened to know me well enough that somebody said to him on the way, by the way, is she keeping her job? And he looked at them and said, well, of course, because he knew me and knew that this was not negotiable. And we all kind of laughed about that later. But the way that the mansion was used to running, the way that people were used to seeing a first lady, was not necessarily as a working mother. And so it was really an interesting, sort of exploration of how to be effective in that kind of role. We also hadn't had someone who focuses on policy in that role either. And so I think it took everyone a bit of adjusting. And I was quite grateful to all the folks in Jefferson City and many different parts of the state government who adapted and were willing to work with me on some very substantive policy stuff. That was an adjustment for me, and it was an adjustment in terms of the role. That wouldn't suit everyone, right? But we all kind of have to find a voice, a way of fitting these positions to who we are as people. And that can take a while to sort of figure out what the right mix and match way of doing that is. So I think we'll all be really interested to see how that plays out with a woman in that leadership role for the first time.
And her husband, who is the first man, right? We've never had, I don't even know what you call him, the second gentleman?
Second gentleman, I like that.
I mean, first and second lady, first and second gentleman, but we've never had to do that. And he is really a pioneer, as much as she is, and to be praised. And of course, he's judged by a whole nother set of deeply socialized stereotypes.
Yeah, very true. Well, I wanted to ask you, switch gears a little bit for a moment, and ask you a little bit about your former work in foreign policy. The State Department's first, female director of policy planning. President-elect Biden has signaled that his administration will shift, away from the America First doctrine that the Trump administration has pursued. And so many observers are anticipating a return to broader multilateral engagement with international organizations and allies and partners around the world. So I wanted to ask you what you expect to be the first steps, or what you would recommend as the first steps to implementing that agenda, and what you think the major challenges to that turn are likely to be.
So I think the way that I often think about his policy is that it's not going to be America first, it's going to be allies first. So he's going to be deeply multilateral by reaching out to all of our allies in Europe, in Asia, in Africa and Latin America. He's already signaled that he's going to create a summit of the democracies, probably with the G7 countries plus Australia, India, and South Korea. He is not going to approach any geopolitical crisis or situation without building coalitions first. So if he needs to confront Russia, he's going to get the Europeans on board. If he needs to confront China, he's going to get everybody on board. If he can, if he's going to conduct Iran, he's going to go back to Europe. So in that sense, he is going to be the opposite of Trump. He's going to be multilateralist versus Trump wasn't an isolationist in the sense of somebody who didn't want to engage in the world, but he was a unilateralist. He wanted to do it America first, America alone. That's not quite the same thing as working through multilateral institutions. Going through the UN, going through the WTO, going through the WHO. I think that's more complicated. Those institutions really need to be reformed. And the Europeans have already proposed to the United States that we partner in reforming the World Trade Organization, and that might well be a good idea. And the United Nations desperately needs reform, because I keep pointing out to people, we're going to be at 2045, and the permanent members of the Security Council are going to be the people who won World War II in 1945, and that just isn't going to work. Nations are just going to ignore it, right? India doesn't have a permanent membership. Japan doesn't have a permanent membership. But reform of those institutions, which were designed for 50 countries, not 200, is slow and painful and often just inconclusive. So I'm not confident, no matter what he says now, that Biden's multilateralism is going to mean a return to those institutions. I mean, yes, he'll rejoin the World Health Organization. No question about that. But I think he might well operate more through coalitions of allies, and certainly participate with international institutions, but it's just a cumbersome system that needs revision and reform, and yet that's not what I would advise him to take on, given the other problems in the world. You're on mute, Sheena.
Thank you. So where would you advise him to start if you were going to give him a short list, right? If we don't start with reform of these institutions, even though, as you know, there are some areas where reform really is needed to update international governance and international institutions for the world and the types of challenges we face today. But is there a short list in terms of where you might advise him to start?
Well, it's an interesting thing. So I would tell him to start by looking to Europe. I think that the way the United States needs to see the world is in terms of the combined weight of the United States and Europe economically. In terms of investment, we're 60% or close to 70% of the investment in the world. We're somewhere between a third and a half of the world's economy, depending on how you count. We're almost a billion, well, we're 850 million people. That's sizable together. We are a huge weight for the rule of law, for international institutions. And this is a really interesting moment because Britain, of course, has left the EU, or will by the end of the year. And the EU itself is changing. And they have really reached out and said it's time for a new transatlantic agenda. And what would be different for the United States is the US generally deals with London, Paris, Berlin, Rome, Warsaw, but the countries of Europe, not the European Union. Yet I think together with the European Union, which still means lots of complicated politics with those national capitals, but for all the creakiness of it, it works better than any other organization like that you've ever seen, and it does arrive at decisions. I would really look at how can you cement that relationship. Could you do not just a trade deal, but a transatlantic deal on things like climate and taxes and technology? And there's some big areas of difference between us on technology, but both of us have a strong interest in not having Huawei wire the rest of the world. So I would start there. I'd probably do the same thing in Asia, and I think that's also the Trump administration was formalizing the Quad. The Quad is the United States, India, Japan, and Australia. Again, building strong coalitions, both because that enhances your power and then makes it easier for you to address the other powers, whether it's Russia or China. So I would tell him to look first to Europe, then to allies in Asia. And then, I mean, I know enough about being in government. You lay all these plans, and then it's like a game of tennis. The balls start coming at you, and you're lucky if you can hit them back roughly in the direction you wanted to go. Right? You're just responding to crises. But the other thing I would tell him to do that I don't think he will do so much, but I think is so important, would be to really mobilize mayors and governors and philanthropists and CEOs and NGOs, the kinds of organizations and governments that have been deeply involved in the Paris Agreement and in climate politics more generally, because I think the United States needs to act on the world stage, not just as the federal government, but as a broad coalition of power that includes all those different actors.
Interesting. I mean, one of the things as someone who works on China that I've paid attention to is the politics of subnational diplomacy in the US-China relationship, which are often quite consequential.
Yes.
So it's interesting to think about how a democracy could mobilize its civil society and local and state governments to be a positive role in the world. I want to get to the questions that I know some of our students have for you. But before I do, I wanted to ask you a question that has to do really with the mission of the LBJ School on this 50th anniversary. And to really ask for your thoughts as someone who formerly headed the now renamed Woodrow Wilson School, or the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. And I wanted to ask you, as someone who is in between policy and academic research and who has trained students and thought about what it takes to train students to have a positive impact on policy, what is it that a policy school like the LBJ School should be teaching our students today? What are the core skills and lessons that we should be trying to impart? And also maybe to ask you a second question there, which is, what are the skills that you think are essential to have to be effective in policy, but also are the hardest for policy programs and policy schools to actually teach in their classrooms or in their programs?
Well, I'll start with the second question. The most important thing you can teach people is the old saw about you can get anything done in Washington if you don't take the credit for it. And that is true, right? If you really want to be effective, you work the system, but working the system often requires giving other people ideas, convincing them they thought of them, moving it, and really behind the scenes. And that's something that's very hard to teach, but you can at least prepare people for the idea that success is collective, not individual. And even the famous bureaucratic turf battles, they're not as ego driven as they seem. What they are is that you, like when I was head of policy planning, if policy planning isn't at the table in a meeting, that means my staff is not there. My staff are the people who are shut out. And the same is true for, the assistant secretary for Asia or the assistant secretary for democracy. So a lot of even that jockeying is you're representing a whole constituency, and you got to make sure that they are at the table. Those are things that I think you can teach, but fundamentally people have to be on the ground and experience. But you can bring in practitioners who can tell those stories and prepare people just as I might talk now. The actual question of a curriculum, I think, is very much in flux. And indeed, I've been part of groups, as has Dean Evans been part of groups, trying to see what the 21st century version of a public problem solving curriculum looks like, because that's the first point. It isn't just policy. Public problem solving includes formulating policy, but also implementing policy, also constantly changing policy. I would include human-centered design, because I think so much of where we go wrong, particularly in domestic policy, but foreign policy too, is we never talk to the people who are having the problem, the unhoused, homeless people. We don't talk to them. We look at the statistics, we figure things out, we build more housing. Often that is not necessarily what the people who are experiencing the problem need or want. And so there's a whole way of public problem solving that I think includes human-centered design, a lot of data science, so that you have feedback loops, you can tell whether your policy is effective or not. Network theory, which is something I do a lot of. How do you build coalitions so that you're actually designing for scale? Those are topics that are not generally on the public policy school agenda or the public problem solving agenda. But the other thing I would say is you have to be teaching at least as much tech as you're teaching economics, because no one would graduate from the LBJ school without having macro and micro. I mean, that's just like that's your bread and butter as a school of public affairs. I would say similarly, you need at least that much knowledge of the workings of the internet and technology more generally, not because you're going to be an engineer, but you'd better be able to work with engineers, just like you have to work with economists.
Great. Those are some really interesting thoughts. I know that there are a couple of curriculum reviews that have been done or are ongoing. And so I'm sitting here taking notes for that. At this point, what I want to do is turn to some of our LBJ alumni and current students who we invited to join us for this conversation today. So if you all could turn on your cameras and join us, that would be terrific. I'm going to introduce all four of them briefly, and then ask them to pose some of the questions that they have after listening to this discussion. So I wanted to start, joining us today is Alyssa Gessler, who is a second-year graduate student at UT in the Masters of Global Policy Studies program, and she's doing a dual degree in that program in Middle Eastern Studies at UT. Prior to being at UT, she worked in foreign policy in New York City, first at the Mission of Jordan to the UN, and thereafter in the executive office of the Council on Foreign Relations. She's a Brumley Fellow here at our Strauss Center on International Security and Law, and specializes in space security, safety, and sustainability. I also want to introduce Khada Hanem, who is a dual degree law and global policy studies student who's passionate about serving marginalized communities and wants to leverage her skill sets in legislative lawyering, as well as immigration, civil rights, and social justice law to uplift the people that she serves. She's clerked for the Texas Civil Rights Project, the Texas Supreme Court, the Open Society Justice Initiative, Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid, and RACES. We're also joined today by Amy Kroll, who is the founder and executive director of the LBJ Women's Campaign School, which is a new program here at the LBJ School of Public Affairs that trains women who want to run for elected office or become campaign managers. Earlier this year, Presidents Bill Clinton and George W. Bush selected her to join the 2020 class of Presidential Leadership Scholars. And before her current role, she spent nearly a decade working in politics at the local, state, and national levels. And then finally, we are joined also by Jade Vasquez, who is a member of the MGPS class of 2020. She's a recent graduate of the LBJ School just this past spring, and is a writer and researcher from the Bronx, New York, with a passion for serving historically marginalized communities. Jade previously served in the Peace Corps in El Salvador and subsequently worked for an education nonprofit that supports immigrant youth. At the LBJ School, Jade particularly studied the intersection between international security challenges and global migration flows, which is a really pressing and thorny policy challenge. She was the co-chair of the school's Policy Alliance for Communities of Color, student representative of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, a foreign language and area studies fellow for the Center for European Studies, and a member of the Clement Center for National Security's graduate portfolio in security studies program. So I'm just absolutely thrilled to have 4 really talented students and alumni joining us today. And so I wanted to give each of you a chance to ask a question of Dr. Slaughter based on today's discussion and things that you've heard or read. So Haida, can we start with you?
Sure. Thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Slaughter. My question is, as the CEO of New America, part of your organization's mission is to bring us closer to our nation's highest ideals. So in your view, what are those highest ideals and what steps are most necessary to bring us closer to them?
Well, it's a very timely question. I think I would start with the promise of equality. I mean, if you read America's founding documents, the Declaration of Independence, it's the very first part, all human beings are created equal. It actually says all men, but I'm gonna give them the benefit of the doubt for now. And that, that really does at least mean an equal shot at living up to whatever your potential is. I mean, human beings are different, and you can't, they're going to be different life circumstances, but you get an equal shot. And we are so manifestly unequal. And those inequalities compound one another, which we've seen right now with COVID in so many ways. So you have a national pandemic. It affects communities of color far more for many different reasons. People having, substandard housing, being jammed together, having far worse health care, having far worse health to start with, their children not having access to the internet so that they can't then learn once you go online. And it keeps going, right? And being much more in low-paid frontline jobs that expose them much more to COVID, but that also are disappearing in various ways. So I think, what we think of now, and we are in the midst of what we're calling a 3-year equity transformation to put racial equity, racial and gender and others, but racial at the core, because that's the biggest problem of the work we do, of who we are, who our partners are, what our culture is. And I really do think that as we look as a nation, right now we're in 2020, in 2026, it'll be our 250th anniversary as a nation, and we'll be on the cusp between being a white majority nation and a plurality nation. If we're going to be the nation we say we are, then we need to be reimagining who we are and how we do things so that we do, in fact, live up to that promise of equality, or at least far, far better than we ever have. I mean, you're never going to get to perfection, but we are really at a point where in some ways I don't recognize the country.
Alyssa, did you want to ask a question?
Absolutely. Thank you again, Dr. Slaughter, for taking the time to be with us today. In a recent piece that you co-authored for Project Syndicate, you advocate for a more expansive definition of national security, which would encompass non-state threats like pandemics and climate change. Could you provide us with an illustrative policy example of an instance in which a shift away from a military response and towards what you call the diplomacy first approach would be effective?
Great, thank you. And indeed, President Biden has talked about a diplomacy first approach. And I think one of the reasons they're taking so long on who's going to be the Secretary of Defense is tied up with wanting much more emphasis on diplomacy than the military. So this is a complicated question, and you know, even in an op-ed, it's hard to unpack. If you just start with the threats that are most likely to kill Americans, if you're thinking about national security, the pandemic and climate are way ahead of China and Russia. It's really that simple. I know, you know, China and Russia are nuclear powers and we could all blow each other up, but in the probability that your life is going to be negatively affected, it is the global issues. So global health, climate, but climate, all the things that come from that, right? Scarcity of food, scarcity of water, droughts, fires, if you just think about the severe weather and what does the severe weather affect and the resilience issues. So if you really started with national security and started by thinking that our job is to protect Americans from threats that come at least partly outside this country that will affect Americans, you'd have a radically different National Security Council. Now, I actually think, having been in Washington, that trying to pull the definition of national security to encompass all that ultimately ends up with the same people, and they are more male than female, sitting around the same table. And then around the edge of that room is the global health expert and the climate expert. So I would actually probably set up something like a global security council. I would really just say, look, there are two different kinds of threats. They're the threats that come from other nations, and those are still important. I'm not suggesting, I mean, Sheena studies China. I'm not suggesting, oh, we should just, you know, we'll ignore whatever China is doing in the South China Sea or against us in various ways, cyber attacks, all of that. I wouldn't say that, but I would say that's one set of threats. And this other set of threats is just as important. But we do not have the infrastructure, the positions, the training, the money to address those threats in the same way. And yet I think most Americans, again, if you polled them, would say, nope, that's really what's affecting my life. The one last thing I'll say about this is the really hard thing about government. I can write that and I can mean it, but you'd have to have a government go to Congress, start putting together the commissions and then the reforms. I mean, these are things that take decades, or at least a decade, and every government is addressing the inbox. So it's very hard to know how to affect that kind of change.
Well, it'll be really interesting, you know, to see the 2017 national security strategy was really focused on this classic framework of great power competition. And we've certainly seen an unusually high impact going into the incoming administration of what I would refer to as non-traditional security threats, in particular, the pandemic and public health. And so it's actually quite striking to look back on these successive national security strategies and see how much they're shaped by the context at the time, right? The document that was written after 9/11 looks very different than the documents that were written during the Obama administration, looks very different from the document that emerged from the early months of the Trump administration. So I think it'll be, you know, I'll be certainly looking to see how it is that the Biden administration defines and conceptualizes national security in the national security strategy when one comes out. I think that'll actually give us some fairly helpful clues to go on as to their approach. Jade, I wanted to turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Slaughter, for being here. In 2012, you published a widely read article titled in The Atlantic titled "Why Women Still Can't Have It All" on the struggles of working mothers, and then a book on similar questions. How have your views changed over the years, if at all, on work-family balance, and what have we learned from 2020 when the pandemic and economic crisis have really impacted working mothers? The term that keeps coming to mind is the she-session idea. My second question is, what advice do you have today for working mothers and aspiring mothers in the foreign policy profession?
Great. Well, so my views have changed a lot. And before 2012, I was essentially a feminist of my generation that was, of course, you can have it all if you just try hard enough. So it was very much, it's on you. If you're ambitious enough and organized enough and you want it badly enough, you can make it work. And I told people that, and that was kind of the mantra of my generation of feminists, and anything else was kind of heresy. So when I published that article in 2012, I pretty much got myself excommunicated from my traditional community because I was saying what should have been obvious to me all along. I mean, I had been hugely privileged and an academic, a tenured academic with another tenured academic husband. I live in a small town with enough money, and I'd been able to control my own schedule. I'd been able to make it work. The minute I was on what most people have, which is a boss, and you have to be on her schedule, and Hillary Clinton was as generous as she could be, but she couldn't make the world stop spinning and giving us events, and she couldn't transport my husband and sons to Washington when they lived in Princeton. And it wasn't a question of how much I wanted it. I mean, maybe it was, in the sense of if I'd been prepared to just say to my husband and to my elder son, who was really having trouble, you're on your own, I got my career, but that's not who I am. And so I at that moment, I realized, wait a minute, we're doing a real disservice by telling people, of course, it's just up to you. There will always be women who can make it work. But my point was, those women are superhuman or self-employed or very wealthy. And that's not a fair standard. We don't require men to be those things to make it. That was 2012, where I was saying we need to change the way we think about career. We need to change workplaces. All that's still true. By 2015, when I wrote my book, I'd shifted even further. And I now believe we're not really going to get gender equality until we value traditional women's work as much as we value men's work. So I was saying beforehand that, my father was a lawyer, my mother was a homemaker. She's also a professional artist, which she started doing pretty much after we were grown. And I was raised to think his work was important and hers wasn't, that I would never sell. I don't want to be a homemaker. Well, I actually now look at all the work she did and I think I'd never be where I am without that. I wouldn't have the support structure. I just couldn't have. And that work is hugely important. And that brings me now to the pandemic, because we are seeing that work has to get done. Without that work getting done, nothing else can happen. But most of the time, it's invisible work. Now, suddenly, it's all being pushed into the home, and it's still on women's shoulders. And yes, there are women who can make it work, but enormous numbers of women are having to choose between educating their children by being with them while their digital education, and trying desperately to respond to the demands of a workplace. And it will not work. So ultimately, if we want women in the workplace, if we want all that talent, right? I mean, we can't afford to do without all that talent, and not to mention the fact that it's inequitable. We have to really change both how we think about careers, workplaces, flexibility, all of that. But we also have to value care. We have to value the men who do it. And this, I'll come to my advice in just a minute. We have to value the teachers, the therapists, the coaches, the navigators, all these people who do kind of care work and who are paid very little, not to mention actually home health aides and childcare and early education. And finally, I do think we're not going to get there until we change men as much as we've changed women. And that means my advice to women is be very, very careful when you are contemplating choosing a mate, about really asking the questions of, are you willing to give up a promotion so I can take mine? Are you willing to really do 50-50 if that means you have to tell your boss you can't go on a trip because you're the one who's in charge? The last thing I'll say is, you also, as the woman, have to look at the man who says yes and say, you are competent and strong and bold because you're willing to break gender norms just as much as we have. And that's going to be a couple decades of that kind of change.
All right, Amy, you're up.
Hi, Dr. Slaughter. Thanks so much for being here. My question builds off of Jade's question a little bit, and allows us to dig a little bit deeper. I wanted to talk more about caregiving in the United States. And we have talked about how much progress has been made, and Dr. Greitens shared her story about her father taking paternity leave at the top of this hour. But I was surprised to learn that out of 41 OECD and EU nations, the United States is the only nation with 0 paid parental leave. And I wanted to know, what would a national paid parental leave look like in the United States? What's a good fit for the US economy and society? And how can we move the needle on this important issue?
So that is a very specific question. And it is appalling. Most of our other OECD countries have maternity leave and paternity leave, or parental leave more broadly. All countries, except I think there were 3 of us, Papua New Guinea and Somalia maybe, have at least maternity leave, which, all things considered, I don't want just maternity leave because I don't want to just presume it's the mother, but I'll take it over nothing, which is what we have now. I do think we're going to get some kind of parental leave, paid family leave, even if the Senate stays Republican, because there's Republican support also. But what we really need is kind of, as you framed it right, paid family leave. We need a budget of time and money that individuals can tap, whether they've had a child and need to stay home, and fathers as well as mothers, or 2 fathers, 2 mothers, however the family is constituted. But equally, if you're taking care of your own parent, right, or a sick husband, or, there's so many ways in which human beings need care. And without an infrastructure of care, the society doesn't function well. And again, it disproportionately falls on women. So there's there's an economic problem, there's a social problem, and there's a deep equity problem. So the best proposals are for this budget for family leave, so that you don't just start with parental leave and then have to expand it to, well, what about elder care? And what about, you want to just recognize that care is the work, I call it the work of actualizing yourself through investing in others. In other words, when you care for someone, you are fulfilled in their success, in maybe just their comfort, if it's an older person, or maybe giving them their best day, or developing a child's brain, or easing somebody, who is ill. There's so many ways that we need to provide for that. And in the process, recognize that it's vital to who we are as humans, and it's vital to our society.
That's a really interesting point, and it feels especially fitting to be having this conversation in 2020. One of the things I think that the pandemic really has laid bare is that, public schools in many cases, or schools in general, have functioned as sites of caregiving, not just of education. And so the impact of having those supports removed for so many families has been especially profound and especially detrimental, and for vulnerable families of various types in particular. And so I think that's, we're having an overdue conversation about the extent to which that responsibility has been placed on schools, and the reality that the economy depends on those caregiving structures, because many people can't return to work. I know my own decisions were based on about teaching and how I was going to handle my work responsibilities were entirely based on what I thought the public schools in my part of Austin, Texas were going to do. And so that's, I think many of us now are having these conversations in a much more transparent way. But as you point out, they're overdue conversations. I wanted to turn, and I'll remind anybody who is watching and listening that if you have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A feature in the screen, and I'll go ahead and see. We probably will only have time for one or two, but please go ahead and put those in and I'll see what we can answer. Dr. Slaughter, I wanted to ask you a question that's come up here in the chat, which is about the question of different types of privilege. And the question, I'll just read it aloud to say, how have you as a white woman in a position of power and leadership advocated for women of color who, as you mentioned, face additional biases and barriers? And are there any lessons that you've learned in your experience doing that, or in your experiences, that would be helpful for those who care deeply about these issues of equity?
It's a great question. I'm writing a book that addresses a number of those questions through my own experience right now. So I'll start just by saying that I actually, one of the reasons I'm as passionate about care as I am is that the majority of caregivers are women of color, and they are undervalued and underpaid. And I would like to see, and my New America works on this a lot, I would like to see that people who are in daycare centers and early education starting at 3, depending on the line, are people that we see as doing some of the most important work in the country. Again, they're shaping the brains of the next generation. And that if the more we can actually value that work and pay for it, as well as social value, we actually are lifting up lots of women of color. But that's sort of one way of thinking about it. Much more broadly, partly I've learned never to talk about feminism for all women. When I first started, I was like, we, as in we women. It's not we women, it's we affluent white women and we affluent white American women of a certain time. Whereas African-American women almost always worked, immigrant women almost always worked. So the whole way of telling the story is highly privileged and assumes that the relatively small number, if you look at the whole country, of affluent white women somehow represents everybody else. Then more broadly, understanding exactly, as I said at the outset, that I think I have a bridge to women of color because I at least understand what it's like to experience lots of implicit bias as a woman. But I now understand that the women I work with who are also of color are getting multiple lenses. And I'll never understand that because I never will walk into a room and have the color of my skin determine how somebody, what they assume about me. I mean, maybe I would in another country, maybe I would if I live long enough in this country, but probably not. And then the last thing I will say, and this is very personal, where I broke apart my job in 2018. I'm CEO of New America, but no longer president and CEO because I promoted a woman to be president and COO. So we split the job, and she was African American. She's just moved on. We're looking for her replacement. And that was really important because I was really sharing power, but I then heard things that I was never going to hear. Right? I mean, and I know this, there are things that I'm never going to tell men. Right? It's a conversation I have among women. Working with her day in and day out opened my eyes in a way that no amount of reading and talking and good intentions was going to do. And so in the end, I think that's right. We have to share power. We have to cede power. We have to really be willing to lift up women of color and understand that the world is going to be a whole lot better when they are treated equally, and that is a whole nother step beyond getting white women treated equally.
Thank you. Again, I think this is just such a timely set of conversations and reflections to be having in 2020, in the time that we have had, and to really point out that an important component of leadership is being attentive to the experiences and vulnerabilities of somebody who might be a different race or ethnicity, a different gender, a different class. That being attentive to all of those forms of privilege and vulnerability is really a critical part of leadership, and also an important part of women's leadership and women's work in public policy and in global policy. So thank you. I'm mindful of the time, and I realize we've just come up on the end of the hour. So I wanted to thank all 4 of our LBJ students and alumni for joining us today. You guys are fantastic. I'm so pleased you could be part of this conversation. And Dr. Slaughter, I also really wanted to thank you for joining us. This is our last event for the In the Arena series for the semester, and it's a terrific one, I think, to close out this fall semester and really this year, because it touches on so many themes that are critical to our national conversation right now. So thank you very much for joining us today.
You're welcome. I'm very glad to have been here and to be your last speaker and send us all into 2021.
Yes, we'll keep our fingers crossed that we see a lot of progress on all of these fronts in the new year.
Indeed.
Thank you
all, and thank you for the questions.
Thank you very much.